welcome all this afternoon. My name's Steve Pfeiffer. I am a William Perry Fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. And welcome to this event organized by the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law. We're going to look at the cyber threat that's out there, particularly as emanates from Russia. And there's been a lot of attention in the last 5 to 10 years about cyber challenges. But it's gone from hacking and going after credit card numbers and industrial secrets now to becoming a military issue. So the Department of Defense now talks about cyber as a domain of conflict, of warfare, just as it talks about air, land, sea, and space. And what we've seen over the last 5 years in the context of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, which began with the seizure of Crimea, is also a very active Russian cyber effort against Ukraine. So what we're going to do today is talk about the nature of the threat, but also a little bit about what governments, private industry, and the nonprofit sector can do to resist and respond to that threat. And just very quickly how we plan to proceed. First of all, Natalia Mikulska will offer a few opening comments. She is a fellow in the Ukrainian Emerging Leaders Project here at the Center for Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, and also a former Deputy Minister of Economic Development and Trade. We'll then turn to our two main speakers. First, Oleh Derevianko, who is the co-founder and the chairman of the board of the Information Systems Security Partners, also based in Kyiv, and also a former Deputy Minister of Education and Science in Ukraine. Our second speaker will be Alex Stavros, who's an adjunct professor here at Stanford, also a William Perry Fellow with the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and for our purposes here, also is the former Chief Security Officer at Facebook, including during 2016, which was a rather busy time for him. After those two main sets of comments, we'll have a little bit of commentary, first of all from Jason Min, who's head of business development at Checkpoint Software Technology, and then by Dafina Toncheva, who invests in emerging technologies at USVP and also is on a number of boards here. And then after the panel, we'll open up the floor for questions. So Natalia, why don't you kick us off?
Yes, thank you so much. I think that the major purpose of this panel is just to show that the things that are going on in Ukraine right now, the cyber attacks that Ukraine is facing almost on a daily basis, they actually are affecting or potentially could affect people that live in Silicon Valley, that live in US, because usually people don't think about that. You know, like why I, living in a Silicon Valley, in the most tech advanced place in the world, should care about cyber attacks, you know, in the country such as Ukraine, which is far away, has nothing to do directly with my business, has nothing to do with my sphere of interest, has nothing to do with Stanford, for example. But the recent example of two major attacks on Ukraine, Russian-sponsored attack, Petya and non-Petya, that a lot of you have heard about, these examples just show that these attacks that are going on in Ukraine can directly affect your work, your business, US infrastructure, global infrastructure, federal infrastructure, and local infrastructure. So they directly can affect the things that are going on over here. And they are the part of the so-called hybrid war of Russia against Ukraine. Why? Because we are not talking only about the military invasion of Russia to Ukraine, but we also talk about cyber attacks. We also here facing a lot of propaganda, both in Ukrainian and Russian media, so informational attack. And one of the fronts that we are also facing is this cyber attacks that Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian business face on a daily basis. Just to give you an example of the things that happened in Ukraine was NotPetya virus in 2017 and what they can have, what effect they can have on you living here or conducting business here. I would like to talk about the example of one of the biggest freight forwarding company, which is Maersk, Danish-based, that its business was blackout for days because of the virus that they got from their Ukrainian partner. So basically the attack that started in a small tech company blacked out the work of Maersk business for a few days, which is the big logistic business. It also stopped the business and operations of a few ports that Maersk was cooperating and was having a business with it's, again, affected the business of partners that Maersk worked with, transportation companies, bookkeeping companies, financial companies, some of the audit companies. But what is most important, it affected the global supply value chains. Because why? A lot of raw materials and components are now shipped globally. So you can have like them used in US, but the part of them are produced in Europe, and vice versa. Part of them are produced in China. So if you don't get your raw materials delivered in time, you are not able actually to produce the end consumer products that you're going to ship. The same apply for end consumer products. And because of that, what we had, that it has a tremendous effect not only on Maersk's business globally, but it has tremendous effect on the whole value chain that Maersk's and Maersk's partners were engaged into. But what we have, the numbers we have about this effect of NotPetya virus in Ukraine, that of publicly traded company, because they need to report it to their shareholders, are just, like for me, they are like tremendously important. For example, Maersk claims that the losses that they got range from 250 to 500 million. But experts believe that it's a very kind of a low estimates, that the number would, rise. One more example, Maersk is only one example. The other example is the pharmaceutical company Merck. Based on its records, they were not able to manufacture some drugs and were shut down their lines, and they claim to lost 870 million, just direct losses. FedEx European subsidiary, TNT Express, required months to recover some of the data and claimed to lose around 400 million US dollars. Mondelez, the chocolate and food, European chocolate and food company, that maker of Cadbury that is sold in US, actually they lost about 190 million. But if we will multiply all these losses to their partners potentially affected, to also not publicly traded companies that are not reporting their losses, it would be actually like the huge scale. The few conclusions that we can draw out of this story, I think that we would discuss more here. The first one is that the physics of cyber attacks are totally different from the military war, because distance is no defense and distance no matter. So basically, in 1 hour, the things that happen in Ukraine could easily be transferred to US, to Europe, or to any other destination. The other thing is that the internet that all of us used in order to connect the different part of the world and in order to boost the global economy, now is actually working also in order to boost cyber attacks, because it, again, easily transfer everything. The second, that these attacks that happened in Ukraine could easily happen now and reoccur on a large scale in Germany, France, or even in US. The third conclusion that we have is that these Russian attacks were primarily targeted not on Ukraine, but also kind of to punish and to warn Western companies saying, you know what, hey, you're doing business in Ukraine, or you have something to do with Ukraine, don't do that, because your business could easily get affected. No partnership with Ukrainian companies, so that's a part of the Russian economic aggression. We can put it that way, to preclude bringing more investment to the country, to preclude European and US companies from doing business with Ukrainian partners. The fourth, I think that there are a few intentions of the cyber attacks, but I'm not a cyber or tech specialist, and I think that we have very prominent speakers here that would talk more about that. What are the intentions of those attacks? But there are a few. One from, just destruction in Ukraine, some of potentially wiping some evidence of espionage, or some others, or even, just grassrooting potentially grounds for potential attacks, future attacks. The fifth, I think that it's very important that Russia has not been imposed with any sanctions, either from EU side or US side in terms of these cyber attacks. And I think that, the saying that no punishment, no crime could work here. So we can, again, face this on a global scale. But what is today? It's like what lessons we have to do. Today, Ukraine is going through a very important election period. In a week, actually, on this Sunday, we will be having the first round of presidential elections. And now, even now, Ukrainian cyber police already reports that there are continuous daily attacks over the infrastructure of the Central Election Commission in Ukraine. Ukraine will also go through the next election, which are parliamentary election in fall. But why it's important? It's important not only for Ukraine, but it's important to the world, because within this year and next year, almost all global economy leaders, countries, would go through the election period. And the things that happen in Ukraine or are being tested in Ukraine, the practices, could easily then be transferred or used for affecting the elections that are going on in other countries. So I think that we shouldn't look only on this particular situation and attacks only primarily from the direct losses standpoint and potential effects on the businesses, but we need to look more globally and to look on these different dimensions of what this attack might have in the future.
Okay, great. Natalia, thank you. Oleh, you've been closer to the front line of this. Do you want to talk about your experience?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Thank you very much for having me here. So I'm delighted to be able to provide some insights of what happened, actually. And Natalia already mentioned a number of things. And I would actually, if anyone who haven't read the story in the Wired magazine, it's called Untold Story of NotPetya Attack, I advise you to do that, because that's a really interesting thing, because even the example of Maersk really clearly shows that this cyber attacks can be even more powerful than nuclear. We hope that nuclear will never be used, but you cannot imagine deployment of a weapon that would put your operations from Los Angeles to Mumbai out of order. That would happen. The Maersk actually works with 17, it says around 76 or 80, I think 76 ports, and 17 out of them were immediately within minutes were non-operational, all over this, I mean, from New Jersey to Rotterdam to Mumbai and so on. But let's look at actually how we arrived at that point, because that was basically a culmination of a number of waves of attacks that happened in Ukraine since 2014. The first wave of attack after the seizure of Crimea, when there were presidential elections and Russia used the defacing attack against Central Election Commission, basically for their internal purposes. So they put for some period of time they just showed the picture that the nationalist candidate was winning, and they used this picture in their own media in Russia to justify the future invasion of eastern Ukraine. That look, there's a nationalist that come into power. The situation was quickly resolved, and that candidate actually got less than 1% of votes. But they used this, and this was a first clear example of the of deployment of cyber means and information operations in the same package. And that's where we see the evolution of the Russian holistic approach to cyber warfare. And that's very important to understand, that they have a really holistic approach, combining the conventional military operation with information operation, with electronic warfare, and with cyber operations. If we go back to Estonia 2007, which basically considered to be the first kind of act of cyber warfare, in Estonia, they predominantly use just two techniques. They use DNS hijacking and they use DDoS attacks. If you go to then Georgia 2008, they used also predominantly DDoS and DNS hijacking attacks, combined with military operations and combined with electronic warfare, attacking the management system, information system of Georgian army during their operation. Then if fast forward, we go to Ukraine, we see all the possible instruments that are available for hackers and adversaries in the cyber domain, like phishing, spear phishing, DDoS attacks. For example, a very interesting example of 2015, the so-called Black Energy attack that caused the first blackout in the western Ukraine. When they reached the culmination stage of the attack and actually acted on target and disrupted the operation of substations and caused a blackout, at the same time there were a DDoS attack, and at the same time there was TDOS, telephone denial of service attack, so that people were not able to call their emergencies and so on. Then there was and when we look at the other waves of the operation, what we see the clear pattern of how they did these attacks. They started with a phishing and spear phishing campaign in the winter of spring. With these campaigns, they got access to the target networks. Then they spent 3 to 6 to 9 months to propagate within the networks, to explore, and to reach the point where they can launch and actually start acting on target. And then there were culmination phase at the end of that. And that pattern was in 2015 with the so-called black energy attack. Then we saw the same pattern in 2016 that caused the second blackout in December in Kiev. And then we saw the same pattern in 2017. And also what is interesting, with all these waves of attacks since 2014 till 17, we saw that the first kind of went after particular industries. For example, there was a wave of attacks against energy sector, then a wave of attacks against transport infrastructure, and a wave of attack against financial sector. And again, in December 2016, when they simultaneously attacked Ministry of Finance, Treasury, Pension Fund, and it was done exactly in the period when Ukraine was working on the budget, and there were risks that people would not receive their pensions in time, and the civil servants would not receive their salaries at the end of the year. And at the same time, there was a wave of attack against transport infrastructure, aiming and disrupting the railway traffic and disrupting the possibility for people to buy actually tickets. When they were buying tickets, typically in Ukraine, they buy tickets like beginning of December for the Christmas period, which is like end of December and beginning of January. So there were like different distinct waves of attacks. And then what we saw at the end of at the mid of 2017 with NotPetya attack, with a simultaneous attack against all the sectors at once. And we saw that they used basically the same tools and techniques that they used previously in those separate waves, but this time they were combined and automated. And that was really remarkable about that attack that they used. That was probably the most automated attack so far, not only the most devastating, but also the most automated attack. The panel is called like lessons learned. So and the question is what kind of lessons we should learn out of that. And of course, Ukrainian enterprises were not that well protected. And of course, the clear lessons for Ukraine, at least, was that there's a huge need to improve the cybersecurity architecture and technologies deployed and people and processes in place. But we also have to learn some other things that are basically more universal, I would say. First of all, from my perspective, this is a universal thing. I don't know, maybe Alex will say it's different in the United States, but it's a very slow decision-making process, both at corporate level and at governmental level. That's a clear. We saw, for example, when in Ukraine after Black Energy attack in 2015, a year after, not a lot actually was done in terms of to improve the cybersecurity. The second thing is the need for more interaction between industries, because some industries are more advanced in cybersecurity, like financial sector or telcos. And for example, if we take the industrial enterprises, they were not thinking that cyber attacks could be, they could be targets of cyber attacks because there's no money to steal. And it turned out that, so they became huge targets. And I remember going to enterprises of industrial sector and explaining why they need cybersecurity. And basically the typical response would be, oh, yeah, we have firewalls, we have this basic, we have antivirus, and that's it. So, and they were not even aware that they needed more advanced tools and they need more advanced measures. So, and then interaction between the industries is also a critical thing, because if we look, for example, at Black Energy of 2015, the first target and the first successful successful for adversaries, realization of that of Black Energy attack, actually targeted media sector. It was the local elections in October 2015 when the adversaries attacked the TV channels on the election day. And the same cyber weapons, to simplify the term, were used basically to cause the blackout and to put the Prekarpattia Oblenergia out of operations. So basically, if there were quicker interaction between industries, we could think about that we could probably avoid these consequences. So this interaction between industries is critically important. So improving cybersecurity architecture, improving the interaction, cooperation between industries and public-private partnership are the core and the essence of the problem, I would say. But even more important thing, in my personal understanding, is that we discussed this a bit earlier today as well. Is that there's still there's still lack of cybersecurity culture, I would say. The cultural thing is a key. So the Peter Drucker said it long ago, but culture still eats strategy for breakfast. And in cybersecurity, it's really the case. So you can deploy as many as the best technologies, the best process and best security teams in place, but the cultural thing of users is one of the weakest links. And I'll probably stop at this point. Maybe then explore later. Yeah.
Okay, Alex, you want to share your perspective?
Yeah, I mean that was pretty thorough. So I'll just reinforce two things. One, I agree that the Ukrainian example is something we need to learn from, especially when we are considering the possibility of Russian adversaries. When you look at the three thrusts of Russian interference in the 2016 election, all three of them had been tried out in the Ukraine before. And so if we had been paying better attention, then we probably would have been better prepared ourselves for that kind of interference. So those three thrusts are the direct manipulation of social media via fake accounts amplification, the hack and leak campaign, so that's the campaign run by the GRU to break into the DNC and Podesta emails, and then to plant those stories in the media and to get amplification that way. And the third was where the Russians felt pulled short intentionally, which is there was kind of initial penetration into the election systems of 21 states, which had a uncertain output, and the public discussion of that is the most kind of stunted of the three, partially because of kind of, I think, natural government secrecy, partially because of the fact that our election system in the United States is run by 10,000 different local authorities. And so without centralized standards and without a centralized kind of incident response mechanism in place, our understanding of what actually happened in 2016 and 2018 is actually quite limited. But if you look at the Ukrainian example, that third thrust of direct attacks on election infrastructure, probably not with the goal of changing the outcome of the election, which is effectively impossible, but with the goal of massively reducing people's trust in the outcome and creating a huge amount of chaos. That is what I think we need to be most afraid of in the run-up to 2020. If the Ukraine is giving us an example, if they're about 6 years ahead of us on the Russian timeline, then that's what we should be concerned about. The other thing that I'd say that we should learn from these attacks is that the truth is that the vast majority of the American economy is not ready to stand up to this level of adversary. If you look at the Fortune 500, so the 500 most valuable companies in the United States, I would estimate 120 to 150 of them are even in the game. Those are companies that have a competent chief security officer, that have a technical team with a variety of different backgrounds, that have the ability to do their own incident response in-house, that have a reasonable amount of logging and auditing. Those companies generally are from the oil and gas industry. The large banks, small banks are totally toast, but the large banks are generally spending a lot of money and doing a pretty good job. Electricity and power generation, some healthcare companies, big tech, defense industrial base. Everybody else facing this kind of adversary is not going to do any better than Maersk or Merck did. And those companies were hacked by accident by the Russians, so that they are effectively civilian casualties in the Russian war against the Ukraine. And so if that level of economic disruption can occur because of a mistake, you can imagine what the economic disruption looks like if it was an intentional part of a battle against Western companies. And that is a very difficult problem. And I think it's not one that we've focused enough on, which is how do we create the conditions on the ground to allow these companies to build the teams they need, to staff them up, to have the incentive structure necessary. I was very fortunate when I was CSO at Facebook. I had around 127 people working directly for me, and we had about 400 engineers who were in a partner org. So we had like 500, 600 people just working on security, not including all the other content moderation and safety stuff. Most companies can't do that. I had ex-NSA malware reverse engineers. I had Russian and Ukrainian speakers. I had ex-CIA analysts. Your normal insurance company is not going to be able to do that. And so, like, what can we do to protect companies that are not able to deploy the kind of resources you can at a Facebook or a JPMC or a Exxon or a Raytheon? We think too much about the companies that actually know what they're doing. We don't think enough about everybody else. And that's where, as the Ukrainian example demonstrates, where the real economic damage would happen if the flag really dropped on a true kind of cyber world war, which I feel bad about myself just saying that, using the word cyber and world war together. But like, it's hard to, we got to think about, this is the other issues with cyber is we've gone to this point where activity that if carried out in the physical world would be considered an act of war, we just call like Tuesday now. In the cyber world. And I think that's another issue that we're going to have to slowly reel back, is we're going to have to reduce what is considered acceptable actions by powerful states like Russia, and what will and will not be punished in those cases. So
That's a really interesting observation, and it makes me think in a way of nuclear weapons. I mean, up until 1945, if you wanted to hold at risk what your adversary valued, his population, his industrial structure, his infrastructure, you had to defeat his military. Nuclear weapons gave you the ability to go around that, and it sounds like cyber is very much that parallel. You don't have to beat the adversary's military.
Right.
You can begin wrecking havoc on his economy, on his infrastructure without that.
Except the barriers to using that first nuclear weapon are so high, and
Right.
both the mental barriers and the possibility of mutually assured destruction, whereas the same, much less destructive, but because I think there's so many more shades of gray in cyber, we've slowly boiled the frog up to a point where if you went back 20 years and you said, so Russia took out the power grid in the Ukraine, messed with the US election, released a worm that caused billions of dollars of damage worldwide, and nothing happened to them, people would say that's insane. I can't imagine that. But we've somehow gone there over kind of a 20-year period.
Okay. Jason.
Yeah, I'll take a step back and just on a light note, it's always good to be back at Stanford. I just found out that it's spring break, so I know all the students in Cabo or Cancun are live streaming this right now, enjoying this discussion, so it's great to be part of that. And when I was a student here over 10 years ago, there was no cybersecurity program, so it's great to see now Alex running it, building the program, and it really highlights kind of one of the problems in the industry where there's a shortage of security talent. So if you think about the US today, there's 500,000 open jobs in cybersecurity. Worldwide, there's 3 million open jobs, and that continually is a problem for all the organizations that Alex mentioned. And then if you get into the weeds, these cybersecurity companies, these positions are some of the highest paying jobs in the world. So some of the tech companies announced kind of the median salary, and two of the big security companies out here announced that it was around 250 grand as a median salary. A chief security officer, or CISO, is commonly paid, one of the highest paid execs at a company. So
not quite.
But at some of the big banks. So this kind of the shortage of job is kind of what's leading to some of the problems worldwide. I think another piece I want to touch on briefly is
I'm sorry.
no worries. Is the sharing of the collaboration between the public and private sector. So when you think about sharing threat intelligence and collaboration between kind of our competitors and peers and customers, there really needs to be kind of a stronger, cohesive alignment around that. Because when you talk about some of the big breaches that have happened in the past with Target, Home Depot, Yahoo, et cetera, in many cases, there was a product that was able to identify the attack, but, as a security organization in a larger company, you're littered with false positives and you don't know how to respond in time. So it's really the communicating these messages and working together, which I think is becoming stronger, but still has a long way to go. And then, you know, the piece around the state-sponsored attacks like Russia, you know, there's a common Russian term called polygon, which means training ground. And they viewed that as kind of some of the early attacks on the Ukraine economy and corporations. And it could be kind of just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg of larger attacks focused on the US. And if you think about these, what we call Gen 5 attacks, state-sponsored, multi-vector, you think about not only Russia, but China, where a lot of their infrastructure, the telecommunications are state-sponsored, and they have some of the biggest cybersecurity intelligence in the world, as well as the US and the NSA. That's a growing budget for the military and increasing importance. So all of these things are, you know, some things we think about at Checkpoint and want to solve.
Okay. Dafina.
I represent the private investment sector. I'm a partner in a venture firm that invests in enterprise technologies, among which cybersecurity is a prominent subsector. I'm Bulgarian, which is another reason why I think I've earned the right to be on this panel. As a prominent Eastern European, I also think that gives me the distinct advantage of also speaking about cyber and investing in cyber. Security, since Bulgarians are right up there with other Eastern Europeans in being very creative in coming up with ways to do damage.
At the top, really. You should be very proud.
Exactly, I'm incredibly proud of that. No, not really. But it's an interesting segue into what I wanted to talk about, which is one of the underlying, or maybe implicit statements that was made or could be taken away from this discussion is, you know, we talked about the damage that has been caused or can be caused by cyber attacks. Infrastructure can be taken down, businesses are taken down, people's lives could be put at risk. And I think it would be easy to make the assumption that the people on the other end, the cyber attackers, are these evil geniuses who are brilliant, who cannot be defeated. And I'd like to correct that potential wrong assumption that some of you might make. What's interesting is many of them are not brilliant, they're not geniuses. And in fact, they're exploiting very well-known, for the most part, they're exploiting very well-known vulnerabilities. So really, it isn't about them being geniuses, it's about the rest of us just being really stupid when it comes to cybersecurity. They're just ahead of us in terms of awareness, and we're just a little behind. And some industries are more behind than others. To Alex's point, I think a lot financial services being frequently attacked because that's where the money is, and that's where the potential for rewards is higher. They've gotten really smart, and they're doing a pretty good job at protecting themselves. The rest of the business sector is significantly lagging behind. You know, just a couple of interesting points to prove that assertion I made. On average, most known vulnerabilities stay unfixed for 200 to 300 days. So imagine that you know that you have a door in your house that's broken and anybody can walk in. And by the way, you live in a bad neighborhood with a lot of thieves. Not smart thieves, but thieves that would just try every door in your house. And you leave that door unlocked and unfixed for 350 days. I mean, you're asking for it, right? Like any of your neighbors would say, well, you're asking for it because you didn't fix it. The problem is that for most enterprises, the doors aren't 4 or 5. They're 400,000 or 500,000. And that's one of the main challenges in cybersecurity is that the attack surface is so massive and attackers only need one tiny little hole in order to get through. So I think that's where the challenge comes from. Again, it's not because we're up against these evil geniuses that no matter what we do, they'll always outsmart us. We're just on the tougher end of the problem where we have a lot to cover and a lot to protect, and they need very little in order to get in and do damage. I think better cooperation between sectors would help. I think better awareness, investment, better practices. Not just one technology will not solve the problem, and many technologies will not solve the problem because the weakest link is us. The humans are the weakest link. So I do not envy the job of a CISO because whenever I talk to CISOs, they say that the hardest part for them is to make the employees do the right thing or not do the dumb thing, they say, right? Don't write your password on a piece of paper and stick it, on your screen. Don't take your laptop unlocked and leave it in your car, and then your car is broken into, and you have 500,000 medical records because you're a doctor and all of your patient data is there. So all these, that's what makes it. All these reasons are why it's so hard for security officers to protect us, protect the businesses that we run. In the end of the day, it's usually about a human error. It's about one of us clicking on a link that we weren't supposed to click on, or leaving our password or our laptop, or leaving a door unlocked somewhere. And I think that, again, that's why it's hard. It's not because the bad guys are so much smarter or so much better than us.
Great.
And by the way, my mother's name is Petya.
Okay, well, let me, thank you. I think these got the panel off to a really good start. Let me ask a couple of questions. Question number one is cooperation between government and the private sector. I mean, I was at Brookings for 9 years, and we actually had the FBI come and sit down with the foreign policy program and say, you have been targeted, and explain some of the ways that we had. But how do you see cooperation with governments? And Alex, you mentioned your ability, for example, to hire people from the NSA and CIA.
Right.
I mean, obviously part of that world, though, is pretty secret. I mean, what is the level of cooperation, and also in Europe and in Ukraine?
So a big challenge in the U.S. is we don't have a truly competent and comprehensive defensive cybersecurity agency. So we have hyper-competent offensive agencies, and U.S. Cyber Command and NSA. They are the best hackers in the world. So the best offensive capabilities in the world are based in the U.S. So good, in fact, that NotPetya was partly powered by an exploit paid for by the U.S. taxpayer, and then stolen and released by a group called the Shadow Brokers, which is probably actually Russian SVR or FSB. But they're hyper competent, but they're all offense all the time, and all of their incentive structure. You don't get if you work for Cyber Command, you don't get the secret handshake photo with the president in the Oval Office for patching 100,000 servers. You get it for taking out Iranian centrifuges, right? And so they've really gone to the offensive, the intelligence side. And so we have, DHS has an organization called CISA, which is brand new. The Cyber and Infrastructure Security Agency. This is the next generation of the NPPD. They have some good people. They're trying very hard. It's kind of a bless their hearts situation there. They are just not as technically competent as NSA and Cyber Command. They don't have the deep pipeline of talent. Cyber Command gets that pipeline because they get their best enlisted and officers, and they push them into it. NSA gets it because they give these scholarships. And they also are super focused on things like the power industry. They're not focused on other sectors. And so effectively, our defensive cybersecurity agency in the United States is the FBI. And the FBI has some very good cyber people, but they are a law enforcement agency. And so their basic operational structure is they watch a crime happen, they take very detailed notes, and then they indict the people responsible 2 years later, right? And that's kind of what it feels like on our side, that we read these great indictments that come out from the FBI and Mueller in 2018 of information that if we had it in 2016, that would have been super helpful. And so I think we have a basic structural problem in the United States if there's not a competent agency whose job it is to prevent bad things from happening, who have access to classified data, and who have the authorities to try to incentivize businesses. And the relationship, while good in some cases and generally through the FBI, is very ad hoc. Part of it is you hire somebody who worked in FBI cyber division, they still have the WhatsApp number of their old friend. It is not like something that is really well structured. And so as a result, you can't rely, if you're in any specific industry, on being able to get that assistance unless you happen to hire the right people with the right connections.
Okay. How about in Ukraine?
I'll tell you how it's in Ukraine, but I'm more worried how it's in the world. I'll tell you why, because I think that one of the biggest challenges, because cybersecurity is, we have no doubt about it now in the panel, it's a truly global issue. But the discourse about cybersecurity becomes very nationalized. Not only about cybersecurity, but cybersecurity as well. So countries basically speaking about their cybersecurity and not speaking about cybersecurity somewhere else. And in Ukraine, I think some challenges are very similar. So we were thinking in Ukraine because the absolute number, the absolute figure of let's say, the salary if you compare the absolute numbers, of course, very low compared to. But if you take the comparative analysis, and for example, and you would compare the difference of salaries for cybersecurity specialists in the state sector, public sector, in the private sector, of course, the difference would be huge both in Ukraine, in the States, and some European countries. So the challenge of the workforce challenge, which was just mentioned, that there are so many open jobs, and there is some research that predicts by 2022 there will be 1.8 million open jobs, unfilled positions. And I think that this and one of the issues, and this is the critical issue for everybody, and how to deal with that. Well, probably we need to look for some new practices. For example, when employees would be able kind of to work for the company, then to go to the government, and to come back. So this cycle happens easier. But there's also in Ukraine there's a very clear lack of coordination between different agencies as well, and even competition between the agencies for the state budget that would kind of to deal. So because there's also like cyber police, which is more law enforcement. There's a cybersecurity center under the special agency responsible for security of information systems. There's general staff and military things. So and all those different agencies, they and the responsibilities are also blurred a little bit. So some agencies think that they're and it's also very interesting for when it's about getting the budget for for cybersecurity programs. Everyone is responsible for cybersecurity. When it's about providing cybersecurity of election systems, then everybody say it's Central Election Commission who's responsible for cybersecurity, and we're just helping here. So that's a typical issue. I would say that there are signs of that the situation improves. For example, there's U.S.-Ukraine cybersecurity dialogue on the governmental level, and there's a lot happening in this direction in this way. But I think that the challenges of public-private partnership in cybersecurity should be viewed not in a national, not just in a national way. We should think how we can bring this discussion to global level, because there's also a lot of possibilities for arbitrage between different legislation systems in different countries. In some countries, certain activities would not be considered as crime, in other countries would be considered as crime. We just talked about the brilliant hackers from Eastern Europe, and if you take, and for example, if you take Ukrainian bad guys, they're not working on Ukrainian targets. Ukrainian bad guys working on targets outside of Ukraine. So they're not sitting in Ukraine and working on Ukrainian banks.
And
because
there
they would be
are
good
some
hackers.
bad guys in Ukraine, just to be, like we also
Yeah.
need
There's
to
actually a
say.
lot, and there's
Yeah.
been a bunch of offensive action.
Yeah.
Just to be
Yeah.
fair,
Yeah.
I got a bunch of Ukrainians up here.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of offensive action by Ukrainians against Russians and
Exactly.
by Ukrainians against American companies.
Exactly,
So
and they're
there's no clean hands on the up here.
Whereas there's Ukrainian corporations and government, they're hit by the hackers outside of Ukraine. Of course, there's a huge challenge of attribution as well, and this challenge is also is not just country specific. It's very different to some countries. In the U.S., the attribution will be whether we attribute it to Russia, to China, or to North Korea, or to somebody else. But in Europe, there will be basically thinking about whether we attribute it to Russia or to NSA or to. So I mean, and they're concerned about not only about Russia or China, they're concerned about American offensive capabilities as well. And this that requires dialogue. That requires more dialogue. That requires bringing cybersecurity to and basically there's a huge new area which is emerging, which you can call like digital geopolitics, which is very under researched at the moment. So and requires a lot of efforts by both governments and big public companies to address.
But just to make a brief comment of what just Alex said, and there are definitely good and bad guys in Ukraine, but the only thing that at least all expert agrees that there is no state affiliation of these hackers that are attacking Western companies. They are not state sponsored, or they are have nothing to do with Ukrainian state. If you compare with the Russian hackers, everybody, it's a general understanding that all of them are either GRU associated, associated with the Russian, their security service, or espionage, or they are state-sponsored. So there is some funds deployed on that. And I think that, like in Ukraine, we have a very unique situation because a lot of people that are working in the tech sector actually volunteered for the state. And I think, like even Oleg and his firm, they actually volunteered. I mean, they provided their services almost pro bono to a number of state actors when the attacks happened. And that was a part of a volunteer movement to fight against Russian aggression. So basically, state was using the free resources that Ukrainian tech companies were providing, in order to solve these problems. But it won't last forever because they need to live. I mean, they need also to earn money. They need to finance their team, so they cannot work pro bono. So this thing also needs to change.
Yeah, we can focus on.
Jason, Dafina,
Yeah, I'll add kind of two stories around sharing intelligence, which we all believe is incredibly important. One is formerly owned by Google, a database called VirusTotal, where many companies and people would put in malicious indicators of compromise, sharing this intelligence so we could use it to block out the adversaries. And about 10 years ago, it was a Russian-owned company was accused, called Kaspersky, of poisoning that well. So they were putting in a lot of false positives and all kinds of nonsense and bad information, which essentially made the VirusTotal database useless. And that gets to the point of, there's a lot of false positives in sharing intelligence, and also kind of one term, TTL, time to live. Sometimes these indicators are only malicious for a certain amount of time, and they can be polymorphic and change. So that kind of creates some difficulty in identifying and sharing information. The second example is there's a lot of money involved. So if you think about the major tech companies here in the Bay Area, Apple, Microsoft, or Seattle and Bay Area, Amazon Web Services, they have huge bug bounty programs. So if you find a vulnerability in, Mac operating system or iPhone, iOS, they'll pay upwards almost $1 million. And then as a hacker on the offensive, do you think about, do I give this to Apple, or do I sell it on the dark web for 10 times more, 5 times more? And that's a problem for a lot of companies and organizations. So when you have this data, what's my incentive for giving it away for free? And that also leads to kind of this big problem around sharing intelligence. And we try to support all the communities. There's a community called Cyber Threat Alliance that we are with our competitors and many other security companies sharing this information. And we run into all these problems all the time, and we talk about it openly, and we want to do it at a more global scale with China, with Russia. But there are some complex barriers that still exist.
My experience as an investor and board member of cybersecurity companies is that that selling to the government is very difficult, and that I take that as a sign of how little the government is interested in emerging technologies, which is where I think all the opportunities to better protect ourselves are. We have, at any point in time, we have at least 10 active cybersecurity companies, and I don't think even one of them sells to the government. And whenever we think about investment in resources to sell to the government, to make the government or government agency our customer, which then means educating them about this technology and the government taking advantage of the innovation, we think about hiring a specific set of people that understand the government very well, that have connections, and we think of it as a 5-year investment. So think about it, if something really truly innovative is being created, we have no interest even in building the company from a business standpoint. We have no interest in going after the government. There are certain companies that have done a good job with that. Palantir probably is kind of the most famous for that, but they're the exception, not the rule. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of cybersecurity companies, and if not all of them, at least probably 10% of them deserve to serve the government, deserve to protect government resources. And we're just not, we as investors, as board members, as part of the leadership team, are not interested in making that investment early on because the government is so difficult to sell to. So again, that kind of tells you how interested they are in the emerging technologies, or at least how equipped that organizational structure is to adopt new technologies quickly.
Okay.
best way for the government to buy emerging security technologies is to get IBM to buy the company.
Exactly. Or Raytheon or any of the other,
Yeah.
3 or 4 approved vendors by the government, correct?
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to wave my magic wand, make you all chief security officers for the United States or for Ukraine. What would be, with complete power, and also a private sector that's prepared to listen to you, what would be the 2 things that you would want to do?
It's a lot of magic.
Well,
I can start it. I will do one thing,
okay.
basically. If it's a magic, okay, so then the magic would be not only that I can do that, but the
We'll
magic
keep it
would be
reasonable
what I
magic,
would
okay.
do. You know? The reasonable magic is to train C-level and board members to understand cyber threats. Because from my perspective, there's a very limited understanding. First of all, there's a very limited understanding of modern cyber threats. Second, it's not on the agenda in most of the boards. It's not on the agenda. So, and because they're not prepared, and then to deal with cybersecurity, then don't know what to ask from their cybersecurity and IT personnel. So in most of the companies, I don't know if there's a research here for US, but we know that in most of the companies in Ukraine, for instance, and many of in Europe, cybersecurity is still considered to be a sole responsibility of IT and cybersecurity teams within the company. It's as if, for example, you have, for example, a finance department, and then you have a financial policies, and everyone who goes on business trip has to report the expenses. They do. Can you imagine if they don't report properly, then financial department is responsible. I mean, it's those employees who are responsible for not behaving properly, right? With cybersecurity, anything happens, and then cybersecurity department or IT department is responsible. And this is the one thing I would change, that to make C-level and boards, both governmental institutions and corporations, to take the right approach to cybersecurity as the responsibility for the whole organization. From that perspective, we can start creating a cybersecurity culture that requires, I really like to think about cybersecurity as of emerging healthcare industry for machines and systems. And we need to apply the same approach. So we need to have this culture of taking the regular cyber health checks for persons, for companies, and train people all the time. That's the essence, because there's no magic pill, and we saw it in. I'm not referring to Checkpoint in any way right now, but we saw in Ukraine that after each major wave of attack, the first thing that happens is that big vendors, they jump in to the government, to corporations, and they start selling their silver bullets. They say, oh, now you put this appliance, and now you will have fully picture of your, that would be that's the wrong approach. And companies, they very often jump in. I mean, and if you are in the skin of the CEO or the head of the board, and you experience a major attack, they are psychologically looking for magic pills. They give us something that will protect us from the future. That's the psychological approach, and sometimes they solve and quickly fix some problems and some gaps, and that's it. And then and that's it until the next wave, until the next wave, until the next wave. So they don't deploy the holistic approach and take it seriously, and especially not only about cybersecurity, but also about the digital resilience. Most of the organization, they still think with the question, if that happens, not when that happens. So if we change if to when, then it changes the perspective completely. Then they would probably deploy better strategies.
Okay. Alex?
On the government side, the big change I would make is a series of changes to laws to incentivize companies to both be open to security feedback and to incentivize them to report breaches. We probably only hear about 5-10% of known breaches because you're only legally required to disclose it if you have a very specific pieces of personal information that are breached. the vast majority of breaches are about economic espionage, about industrial espionage, about national security impact that has nothing to do with people's personal information. It's just kind of silly, historical. People care about credit cards. That's not what the Chinese or the Russians care about. And one of the reasons people don't voluntarily disclose is the moment you say we had a breach, you end up with auto-generated shareholder lawsuits filed by plaintiffs' attorneys. So we need a structure where companies are incentivized to come forward, say this is what happened, for them to explain in public of all of their failings and do root cause analysis, and then be incentivized to fix it, and to have a legal regime that incentivizes that instead of disincentivizing it. Right now, only the lawyers win, right? Like, I was deposed 5 times about the Yahoo fight with the FSB. None of that work, the hundreds of millions of dollars that were spent on litigation, none of it made anything better. Like, that was all wasted money into the pockets of the lawyers. Nothing got fixed. And that is just, like, from a societal perspective, a huge freaking waste of money and time. And then for companies, if I could wave my magic wand at all of them, would be that they need to outsource as much of their infrastructure as possible. Nobody in this country is qualified to run a secure email server against this level of adversary, except Google and Microsoft. Nobody should be running their own infrastructure if there's a cloud service. Nobody should be running software that was written by another company on-prem. You are not able to do so against this level of adversary. There's been people have gone the opposite way because of a number of different, accounting and sunk cost on CapEx, and CIOs not understanding the cloud, and they're wrong, and I'm right. So yeah, so if I had the magic wand, I wouldn't have to have that argument over and over again, and we could just fix it.
Okay. Jason.
It's a great question, by the way. I'll take kind of the long-term magic wand approach. I would, obviously Stanford has started to create a world-class cybersecurity division, but I really start at, the youth within high school and all the universities within the U.S. and worldwide, and create programs to educate people about cybersecurity, because, as the panel mentioned, sometimes the weakest link are the employees or the people working at the company. So I think that would be a great start, and it's something that should be more prevalent. Unfortunately, it's kind of a specialized skill, and you see kind of all the demand for computer science and programmers here in Silicon Valley, and there's a lot of competition for talent with all the tech companies, including with cybersecurity companies. So I think all of that education, starting at an early age, for high school and college, I think would be a great way to start.
Okay. Dafina.
I mean, I don't have much more to add from what the panel already suggested. I do think that it's about awareness and also alignment of incentives. If you think about why the financial industry is so much better than the rest for the most part, solving those problems, it's because number one, they were the most attacked, so they are most aware of the problems and best educated. And spend a lot of resources on fixing the problem. And number two, it's because incentives are very well aligned. There are punishments, not only reputational damage, but also legal and regulatory repercussions. And I think that framework can be applied to almost any other industry as well as the government. You have to create awareness. You need to have the resources to invest both in that awareness, but also in technologies that protect, and in people who understand those technologies. And also, you need a legal system that aligns incentives. That people lose their jobs if these things happen, because otherwise, people just have no interest in being aware. To your point, why would a board member care otherwise, unless the government goes after them and says, you're going to lose your job, we're going to shut down the business, we're going to sue you for hundreds of millions of dollars, and people will go to jail. Once people's careers and a lot of money is on the line through laws, everybody cares all of a sudden. And I think that awareness and caring about the problem is kind of one of the things that's missing on all levels.
Yeah.
I would just add up a few things that are very this specifically apply for Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is known as a big tech talent pool in the world now. The one thing that Ukrainian government actually, or me being the chief cybersecurity officer in Ukraine, what I would do, I would just invest more in education to create more cybersec programs in technical universities to have people more actually, like working on this subject, on this particular subject, especially when, like before they graduating, because for Ukraine, it's a national security issue now. So you just need to invest in that. The second issue, when people get out of the university, so when they are at the universities, you need to create a state incentives for those people to start their cybersec business rather than to go to US to work for some, like big corporates here. What you can do, you can provide some seed financing by the state for them just to start their first venture. And potentially, maybe then we will have people actually not moving here, but having more companies like Oleg's business in Ukraine. The other issue is how all of these people would get exposure to the cyber threat, actually data and attacks, if they will have a private-public partnership with the Ukrainian government. Because what they can do, the government is exposed to this attack. What you can do, you can use all the information and data that the government has in order to create a new potential business. So basically, the government would get, like some technology at the end that they can use, and the company could get an access to the most advanced data and to the most recent, like attack exposure. So I believe in three elements. First, education. Second is public and private partnership. And the third one is still seed investment from the state.
Can I add something? I think that's, I agree with all that said, but the only thing that I don't know, I don't have an answer. But I just want to bring it up, just to share, because it's something that makes me awake. There's a problem with, even let's say we have unlimited resources to put into education for cybersec guys. Let's assume there's a good salaries for cybersec, but working in cybersec requires also certain mindset and desire to work in cybersec. If we look at Ukrainian talents, for example, there's a lot of talented programming in Bulgaria, all the Eastern Europe, partly because we still have this legacy of mathematical education in schools and so on. But you have a very skillful IT personality or tech personality, or somebody who's really likes to code and so on. It's very difficult to get this talent. We compete not only for the talent, the generic company. We compete against those software developers, against all those fancy businesses that develop mobile apps, games, and so on. And this young person who actually graduates from the computer school, he wants to go develop cool stuff. He doesn't want to go and see and look for threats, in the systems. And I don't know how to tackle this problem.
I think that the free markets solve that problem.
Really?
I think you're not paying enough.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you just pay more then.
No. Okay.
I really think
Yeah.
that the free market solves that problem. You just pay until people are more interested in that than they're interested in a game, in building a game. There's always going to be people that
Yeah.
are interested in where their utility value, the utility value of building a game is whatever infinite, so you
Yeah.
can't compete. But I think for the vast majority of people, at some point, they
They
go
just
where
want
the
to-
money is. I think so.
Yeah.
There are a lot of cybersecurity companies here, and they attract really good talent.
Yeah. No.
And I think here companies compete just as much, right? The competition here is pretty fierce. So I think it is about it's about the reward that they get on the other end. I don't know, Alex, what do you think? You're pretty cool and you chose security.
Yeah, and here I am. I'm out of the industry, right?
Well, but you had a big impact, and now you're trying to have a big impact in a different way, though.
Yeah, part of our problem
You
is...
haven't given up on it, right?
Sure, yeah.
You're just using a different angle now.
Part of our problem is there's not, even though there is attractive salaries, the number of educational options that actually make you qualified to do these jobs
Okay,
is
well, that's
extremely
different.
restricted,
Yeah.
right? And so the number of choices you have, there's a lot of kind of really fraudulent University of Phoenix-like kind of training out there that's not serving, just generating debt and not creating people. And part of the problem is that Oleg's right, like doing security is not just about the technical specifics of the technology. It's about building a mindset of thinking adversarially, of looking at a system and understanding innately this is how this thing can go wrong. It's a level of paranoia to do that.
You have to
And then,
absolutely.
and then to like think adversarially through the rest of your life, which is then, it's a horrible thing. It's a horrible way. It's like, I'm sure how doctors are always looking at people and trying to be like, oh, that person's got 12 years left. And it's going to be like once you start to think this way, it's difficult to turn it off. But, and that's a hard thing to teach. And because the other chicken and egg problem is we don't have a lot of practitioners doing teaching, right? And so that is an issue. It's not an easy one. I wish we had some good ones. I think, the way we tried to do this at Facebook, I really wanted to diversify the team. And if you keep on handing around, by definition, the same 5,000 security people in the Valley and just give them all raises every time, you're not,
Right.
one, you're running out of money, but you're also not diversifying the industry. And so, but we had the benefit of already having people and already having problems. And so what we could do is we built what we called an associates program, where we brought people in who were just really not ready for their jobs yet, but we gave them 6 months to apprentice. And so it is possible for companies to do it. It's actually quite hard, I think, for educational institutions to do it. If I need to train people to that level here, it'd be very hard for me to do so, because while I can give them book learning and give them my experience, it's very difficult to sit them down and say, I'm going to supervise you while you reverse engineer this piece of malware, and then you write the IDS rules for it, and then you do a forensic investigation, and then you're part of like the legal response. That's the kind of experience people need to really get good. And so it's tough. I think it is going to be partly on educational institutions to teach more practical stuff. So to pitch, one of the things I teach here is a hacking for non-CS majors class. So we teach hand-on offensive hacking skills to law students, MBA students, public policy, social science. Not going to try to make them cybersecurity workers. I'm trying to make them better at their jobs when they then run into cybersecurity in the future. But then I think a lot of it's going to fall to industry to find people with good potential, and then to spend the 6 months, 8 months, 9 months it takes to make them qualified.
Great. Well, please join me in thanking the panel for
Thank
a
you.
very depressing conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.